This podcast details true crime cases. It contains adult themes and may contain descriptions of violence. It is not intended for children. Listener discretion is advised.
Thank you for joining me for today's episode of Once Upon a Crime. In June, in the United States, we set a Sunday aside to honor our fathers or father figures. We honor them for their love and devotion, wisdom, strength and protection, and many other things they bring to our lives. But not every dad is a shining example of paternal love. Some are downright nightmares. I'm sharing these dad stories this month in a series titled Deadly Dads. Christian Longo portrayed himself to his family, friends, and community as a devoted husband, loving father, and successful businessman. In reality, he was none of those things. He lived a life of lies and deception. When he could no longer keep up the facade, he disposed of his old life in favor of a new one by destroying his entire family. This is Chapter 2 of Deadly Dads, Family Annihilator, Christian Longo. On the morning of December 19, 2001, a body was found floating on the bay shore of Waldport, a town located in coastal Oregon, about a mile inland from the Pacific Ocean. It was the body of a young boy, clad only in a pair of underpants. First responders estimated the boy's age to be between 4 and 6 years old. There were no missing persons reports in the area of a child of that age or description. Divers were called in to search the water around the area where the body was discovered. 3 days later, a pillowcase was found printed with characters from the Rugrats television cartoon. Tied inside of it was a large rock. Not more than a couple of hours after this discovery, a second body of a child was found. It was that of a girl, even younger than the first child. She was estimated to be about 2 or 3 years old. Tied to the little girl's right ankle was a floral printed pillowcase. Inside was a rock that investigators concluded had been used to sink the body to the bottom of the bay. The boy's body must have broken free of its pillowcase anchor, leading to the discovery of both children. Police still had not received a report of a missing child, let alone two. In an attempt to identify them, a retouched photograph of the little boy was released to the media. They soon received a break in the case. A woman named Denise Thompson came forward to report that she believed the child was 4-year-old Zachary Longo. She was a co-worker of Zachary's father, Christian Longo. She had last seen Zachary when she had babysat him and his sisters, 3-year-old Sadie and 2-year-old Madison, on the night of December 15th, 4 days before the body was found. She said their father had asked her to watch his children so he could take his wife, Mary Jane, out to dinner and a movie. Thompson described the Longos as a friendly young family. They were devout Jehovah's Witnesses. Mary Jane was a stay-at-home mom devoted to her 3 children. Christian and Mary Jane had been married about 10 years and had only recently moved to Oregon. Investigators asked Thompson if she'd seen Christian Longo or his wife since the night she babysat the children. Not Mary Jane, she said, but she'd had lunch with Christian on December 19th, the same day his son's body was found in the bay. She explained that she worked with Christian Longo at Starbucks, and they had taken their lunch break together. That is when he had dropped a bombshell. Her coworker told her his wife had just left him for another man. He said Mary Jane had taken the children and flown to her home state of Michigan. Thompson said she was surprised to hear this news, since she hadn't noticed any tension between the couple, and Longo had never mentioned having marital problems. He also said he now wasn't sure if he was the father of his youngest child, Madison. Investigators wondered, where were Mary Jane and Madison? They needed to track down Christian Longo. But Longo had skipped town right after the body in the bay was reported by the local media. On the surface, Christian Longo appeared to be an ideal family man and loving husband. But he had been living a double life for years. Longo had a history of financial crimes and at least one warrant for his arrest. Now 2 of his children were dead, and his wife and youngest child were missing. A week later, divers retrieved 2 large suitcases in the Bay Harbor directly in front of the Longos' rented condominium in Newport, Oregon. In the first one, the nude body of Mary Jane Longo was found folded into a fetal position. In the other, 2-year-old Madison's body was found clothed in only a diaper. The medical examiner conducted autopsies and concluded that Mary Jane and Madison had died by manual strangulation. Zachary and Sadie were determined to have been killed by, quote, asphyxiation by unknown method. The Longos' condominium was searched. It had been cleaned out of all their possessions, and Christian Longo was nowhere to be found. He would be added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. But by that time, he'd be on the run and would soon flee the country. Christian Longo was born on January 23, 1974, and raised in Ypsilanti Township, Michigan. His mother Joy and adoptive father Joe raised their children as Jehovah's Witnesses, a Christian movement founded in the 1850s. Members, or witnesses, are encouraged to evangelize new converts through door-to-door ministry. As a young man, Christian was trained and served the church this way. Longo met Mary Jane Baker, who was also a member of the church when he was still a teen. Mary Jane was 6 years older than Christian. They married when he was 19 and she was 25. At age 22, Longo was hired to work for a company that distributed the New York Times. Longo became a fan of one of the Times' writers named Michael Finkel. Finkel wrote a travel column with colorful stories about far-flung destinations Longo had only dreamed of. He read his column religiously and would later use the information he'd stored away while on the run from the law. But more on this later. At the age of 25, Longo quit his job to start a business called Final Touch, a cleaning service that catered to contractors. Members of the Longos' church congregation wondered how the family could afford their lifestyle. They always seemed to drive new cars, and Christian took his wife on expensive vacations. Christian claimed that his business was booming, but the truth was, he was drowning in debt. Longo had been deceptive about his finances since the beginning of his marriage. Not only had he lied about how much money he had, but he'd committed theft to cover up his lies. He couldn't afford a wedding ring for his new bride, so he stole money from an employer to purchase one. Longo was clean-cut and polite and had a boyish charm. He easily convinced people to believe he was well off financially. But he was paying for his lifestyle through criminal means. He took out loans under false or stolen identities, printed counterfeit checks, and used them to purchase items and withdraw cash. Mary Jane was unaware of the elaborate means her husband took to keep her in the dark about their precarious financial condition. When their car was repossessed for lack of payment, he created a fake driver's license, took it to a car dealership to test drive a new van, and drove off, committing grand theft. He gifted the stolen van to his wife for her birthday. Needing a big cash layout to hold off creditors and maintain his lifestyle, Longo counterfeited checks from a client in excess of $30,000. He was caught and prosecuted. Under Michigan law, Longo could have received up to 14 years in prison for each of the 7 counterfeited checks. But he explained to the prosecutor that he was his family's sole provider and had panicked over his growing debt. He had taken desperate measures to keep his family afloat, he claimed. Longo was sentenced to 3 months probation and ordered to pay back the $30,000 he'd stolen in lieu of a jail sentence. Mary Jane was shocked to learn about the theft, but believed her husband when he told her it had been a one-time thing and that he'd learned his lesson. But when Longo couldn't keep up with the payments to the court, he instead packed up his family and left Michigan for Ohio. Things would soon go from bad to much worse for the Longo family. Christian Longo left Michigan for Ohio with his family, violating the terms of his probation. A warrant was issued for his arrest. In May 2000, Mary Jane called her sister, Sally Clark. She was distraught. She told Sally she discovered through emails that her husband was cheating on her. She'd confronted him, and he had admitted the affair. Tearfully, she told her sister that Chris told her he no longer loved her and that she was, quote, no fun since the children were born. He complained that she spent all her time and attention on them and neglected him. Her sister told Mary Jane to come home to Michigan. But although Mary Jane was devastated at the discovery, she didn't want her children to grow up without their father. She was determined to make her marriage work, she said. Besides, she still loved Chris. In 2001, the family moved often for supposed opportunities, though Longo was actually avoiding creditors. They settled in Ohio, residing briefly in a warehouse, where he maintained his facade as a prosperous businessman. He continued to cash forged checks and eventually drew the attention of local police. Longo went on the run again, and in September, they settled in coastal Oregon. Mary Jane's family was in contact with her until the late summer and early fall of 2001. When her cell phone service had been cut off, they felt something was amiss and reported her missing to the police. After receiving the report, officers visited the Longos' previous residence at a warehouse in Toledo, Ohio. Although the family had left, investigators discovered personal items such as Mary Jane's wedding dress and photos. Additionally, they uncovered books on identity change and a Spanish phrase book. Christian Longo had run his family's finances into the ground by living above his means for years. They were now on the run from his outstanding warrants and investigations into his financial crimes when they landed in Newport, Oregon in September 2001. Longo took a part-time job at a Starbucks coffee franchise located inside a Fred Meyer grocery store. On November 1st, he rented a room for his family of 5 at the Newport Motor Inn. Still trying to save face, Longo told the motel manager that the Starbucks Corporation had sent him to set up a new location in the area. He immediately began planning his final escape from the law, his financial woes, and the life that had never lived up to his expectations. In mid-November, he printed out the obituaries of 4 men of his approximate age found in the local newspaper. Social Security numbers were handwritten on these pages. While working his shift at Starbucks on November 20th, Longo stole a credit card number from a customer transaction. On November 30th, he moved his family into a high-end condominium on Newport's Yaquina Bay. He passed himself off to the condo manager as a subcontractor hired to work for a high-speed internet company. 2 weeks later, on December 15th, Christian Longo took the night off of work, hired his coworker to watch the kids, and took his wife Mary Jane out on a date. They returned about 10:30 p.m. It was the last time anyone saw Mary Jane or the children alive. Detectives picked up the investigation from this point, tracking Longo's movements. Between midnight and 2 a.m. on December 17th, he returned to the condo after ending his shift at work. Around 2 a.m., an upstairs neighbor heard dragging noises coming from downstairs. The neighbor lived directly above the Longo's unit. These sounds lasted about 15 or 20 minutes, detectives were told. Later that morning, at about 4:30 a.m., a construction worker saw a red minivan stopped in the middle of a bridge, a few miles north of the Longo residence. He stopped to see if the driver needed help. A man fitting Christian Longo's description thanked him, but said he'd only pulled over briefly because his check engine light had come on, but he declined help. That night, Longo worked his scheduled shift at Starbucks until 11 p.m. The following day, the housekeeping staff at the Newport Motor Inn, the Longo's former residence, found trash bags containing children's clothes and books, and a wallet containing Mary Jane's driver's license in the dumpster behind the motel. That afternoon, a green Dodge Durango was stolen from a dealership in Wilsonville, about 2 hours north of Newport. A maroon-colored van was left behind. The license plates had been removed, but the foam material that the plates had been mounted over was found to have an impression that read Kid Van, the personalized license tag issued to Mary Jane Longo. Christian Longo attended a company Christmas party that night. A coworker recalled that he arrived in a green Dodge Durango. The next day, Zachary Longo's body was being pulled from the bay at about the same time Christian Longo was telling his coworker that his wife had left him. Using a stolen credit card from a Starbucks customer, Christian Longo made his way first to San Francisco before flying to Texas and then crossing the border into Mexico. Longo arrived in the resort town of Cancun with only $200 in his pocket. He drank and partied with other tourists. 2 weeks after he arrived, he met a German tourist named Janina Frank. Frank was a photojournalist who traveled to the area to explore and photograph the Mayan ruins. Longo introduced himself as Michael Finkel, the travel writer whose column he'd followed in what must have seemed a lifetime ago at this point. He said he was a writer for the New York Times and was also interested in the Mayan culture. He turned on the charm and suggested they collaborate on a story. He would write it, and she could take the photographs. Frank quickly agreed to travel with him to the ancient city of Tulum, about 2 hours south of Cancun. She was just beginning her career as a photojournalist and was excited by the prospect that her photos may potentially be published in the New York Times. On the drive to Tulum, Longo, aka Frinkle, told Frank he was divorced and had no children. Back in the States, Longo was being sought by the FBI as the prime suspect in the murder of his family. In early January, Canadian tourists recently returning from Cancun saw a news report about the wanted fugitive. They immediately recognized the photo as a man they'd met at a campground in Mexico. They phoned the FBI and shared this information. On January 13th, Christian Longo was arrested at a Tulum campsite. FBI agents arrived in the middle of the night, accompanied by Mexican police. On the trip back to the States, an FBI agent asked Longo about the murders of his wife and children. Longo reportedly answered, "I sent them to a better place." Christian Longo was extradited to the U.S. after being convinced by the FBI that it was better to take his chances with the American justice system than end up in one of Mexico's notorious prisons. Because Mexico is a country that does not impose the death penalty, authorities in that country generally will not agree to extradite fugitives to the U.S. unless prosecutors agree not to seek the death penalty. Whether Longo was advised of this detail would remain in question. On March 10, 2003, Christian Longo's murder trial began. He took the stand in his own defense. He admitted that he killed his wife and 2-year-old daughter, Madison, but he claimed he did not murder his 2 other children. He explained his actions with an implausible story. He said that one night in late December 2001, he sat his wife down and told her the truth about everything. He admitted to all his lies and deceptions over the years and explained in detail their true financial situation. They were broke, he said, and were living on borrowed time. The following night, when he returned from work, Longo said his older children were missing, and Madison, quote, seemed lifeless. His wife was behaving erratically, he claimed. Quote, she was literally on the floor, curled up in a ball, bouncing back and forth, hitting her back against the wall, end quote. Longo accused his wife of killing 4-year-old Zachary and 3-year-old Sadie in, quote, a fit of rage after learning about their financial problems. When he discovered what she had done, he said he snapped. Quote, I grabbed her with both hands and I continued to squeeze. I didn't stop for a long time. I didn't stop until I couldn't hold her up anymore. After he realized what he'd done, he panicked and began stuffing the bodies of Mary Jane and Madison into suitcases. As he did so, he said he noticed Madison was still breathing. Things had gone too far, he said, and there was no coming back from murdering his wife. In an act of self-preservation, Longo admitted that he ended the life of his toddler. Quote, I put my hand on her throat and squeezed. Longo's defense depicted their client as a man thoroughly defeated by his bleak financial situation and excommunication from his church. The defense argued that Longo was not responsible for the murders of Zachary and Sadie, citing their cause of death as drowning. They highlighted that he had strangled his wife and youngest child before disposing of their bodies. The defense urged the jury to question why he did not use the same method for the other 2 children instead of leaving them alive before placing them in the water. It just didn't make sense, they said. But the prosecution countered this argument, stating, quote, Longo's 2 older children showed signs of asphyxiation, but autopsies could not determine exactly how they died. Asphyxiation could include drowning or smothering, end quote. The prosecution argued that Longo considered his family a burden and murdered them to gain freedom. They presented evidence suggesting premeditated killings. Longo's computer search history included topics on identity change and methods of murder. They also pointed out to the jury that Longo committed more financial crimes after killing his family. He then spent 3 weeks in Mexico partying on the beaches and even started a relationship with a female photojournalist. The prosecution presented a witness who remembered spotting a red minivan near Lindslao Bridge on Monday, December 17th in the early morning. The witness informed the jury about a conversation with a solitary male driver beside the van. He confirmed no presence of a woman or others near the vehicle, contradicting the defense's argument against Mary Jane's alleged involvement in her children's deaths. Sally Clark, Mary Jane's sister, testified next. She explained to the jury that Mary Jane found out about her husband's affair 18 months prior to her death. The family lost contact with Mary Jane after they fled, and her phone was deactivated. After only a brief deliberation, the jury convicted Christian Longo of killing his 4 family members and decided on the death sentence. Before handing down the sentence, the judge spoke directly to the defendant, stating, quote, "The facts of this case reach a level of perfidy beyond anything I have ever experienced. It is impossible, in my judgment, for you to either atone for these crimes or expect absolution." He sentenced Longo to death. Prior to his sentencing, Longo confessed in court that he had been self-centered during his 3-day testimony, discussing untrue negative aspects of Mary Jane. He expressed newfound remorse, stating, quote, "I take full responsibility for my actions." Mary Jane's sister Penny stated tearfully that she believed the death penalty was a fitting sentence for her brother-in-law. Quote, "Chris deserves his punishment and so much more, and yet it will never be enough. He murdered and then threw away those he should have protected and cherished." End quote. Sally Clark added that the only thing her sister was guilty of was trying to be a good wife and mother. After his verdict, Christian Longo said, "I know I will never be able to do anything that is going to bring anybody back. I know that you have cried, the community has cried and wondered how anyone, much less a dad, could do anything so horrible. I can't answer that." Christian Longo's defense attorney filed an appeal of his death sentence, stating that the FBI had misled their client into returning to the U.S. from Mexico, denying him his right to have the death penalty waived before being extradited. In 2006, the Oregon Supreme Court upheld Longo's death sentence. In 2011, Longo admitted unequivocally that he'd killed his wife and 4 children. In an attempt to make amends for the horrific crime he'd committed, he told the New York Times that he was working to overturn a law that forbade inmates from donating their organs. In that same year, the state of Oregon issued a moratorium on executions. Longo and 17 other death row inmates, including serial killer Dayton Leroy Rogers, were moved off of death row and placed in the general prison population. Longo's sentence was commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Oregon's Governor Kate Brown decided to abolish the death penalty because she opposed it, stating that she found capital punishment, quote, "immoral, inequitable, and irreversible," end quote. Michael Finkel, the journalist Christian Longo had impersonated while on the run in Mexico, reached out to him while he was awaiting trial. The writer and the prisoner began a correspondence, and Finkel traveled to meet him. They struck up an odd friendship that was later chronicled in a book written by Finkel titled True Story, Murder, Memoir, and Mea Culpa. The book was made into a feature film in 2015, starring James Franco as Christian Longo and Jonah Hill as Michael Finkel. That will do it for this episode of Once Upon a Crime, and will conclude our series, Deadly Dads. You can also watch accompanying videos of our episodes on YouTube. Look for Once Upon a Crime podcast on YouTube and click subscribe. There's a link in the show notes. We'll be off for a brief summer break for the next 2 weeks. New episodes of Once Upon a Crime will return on July 15th. You can get extra episodes of Once Upon a Crime by becoming a Patreon member. As a member, starting at just $5 per month, you can listen to every episode of Once Upon a Crime ad-free and hear them before anyone else. You'll also get other perks like goodies sent to you in the mail, bonus episodes, bonus videos, and sneak peeks behind the scenes of the podcast. You'll also earn my undying gratitude. Go to patreon.com/onceuponacrime to find out more and join, or click on the link in the show notes. Once Upon a Crime is written and produced by me, Esther Sanchez Ludlow. My executive producer is Lorena Garcia, and research for our episodes is provided by Emma Battaglia. Until next time, be good to one another.